Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 46 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with me, Rory Lees-Oakes, and with me, my fellow traveller on the information superhighway, Mr. Ken Kelly.
Really good to be here. Exciting time. I mean, as we go out live with this podcast, we're coming, I guess, towards the end. We're at least acknowledging the end of the United Kingdom academic year. And I am mindful that many of you may be submitting final portfolios. You may be getting assignments sorted that need to be handed in. And it can be a busy time for students at the moment. And with a busy time comes potentially elevated stress levels. And we're going to be kicking off episode 46 looking at that. And Rory's going to be kind of guiding us through what might be happening within our very own brains as we feel that stress and how that can impede our ability to actually put those final portfolios or those assignments in. Theory with Rory today is interesting because you're going to be talking a little bit about trauma bonds, Rory.
I am, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about something that is quite uncomfortable to hear. But what I will share with you is many years ago, there was a film called The Night Porter, and I think it had Dirk Bogarde and Charlotte Rampling in. And Dirk Bogarde was an ex-Nazi SS officer in a concentration camp, and Charlotte Rampling was a inmate or a prisoner. And they had an affair in the camp, and many years later he escaped justice and was working as a night porter, and she went into the hotel and they took up the relationship, and it was quite a 50 Shades of Grey relationship. So for those of you who's listening with little ears around can read between the lines on that. And a lot of people said, this is terrible. How could someone who'd suffered such deprivations in a concentration camp do that? And of course, this was very much a fantasy film. However, it does link into a strand of truth that sometimes people who are abused build trauma bonds with the abuser, and those bonds are very hard to break. And it doesn't matter about the timeline. It could be that 20 years later they meet the abuser again, and all of a sudden they're snapped back in to the behaviour that they were forced to undergo. Ooh. So I'm going to be talking about that theory, and that is really useful, and I see it in my practice occasionally through the years.
It's really, really interesting. It takes me back to a podcast we did in our back catalogue on Stockholm Syndrome, and we covered a similar type of topic. Looking forward to that. And of course, we're going to be ending episode 46 today with looking at your own therapy as a student of counselling psychotherapy. Many of the awarding bodies call upon you to do an amount of hours of therapy, some more than others, some modalities more than others. And we may have different feelings around that. We're going to kind of explore what your feelings might be and some of the reasons maybe that is put in place by the awarding bodies and seen as good practice. But we kick off at this potentially stressful time. I don't want to be projecting that out. If you're going, I'm not stressed, then that's cool. Hang on to that. But if you are finding yourself kind of rushing in assignments, finalising work as you come to the end of the academic year, Rory, can you share a little bit about what happens? Because I know when I was submitting my final portfolio, a massive body of work, there were times where I felt that I just couldn't do it, and I would sit down and I thought all this information that I'd studied and knew so well was just gone. The filing cabinet was empty as I stared at the blinking cursor.
The blinking cursor. Well, that's a very polite way of putting the blinking cursor. Yeah, well, only this week, Ken, I can give you a clear example of what happened at Counselling Towers. We were rushing out of Counselling Towers here in Mosley, and I rushed out, and I had loads to do. I had to get to my practice. There was loads and loads of stuff, and I couldn't find my car keys. I'm saying to my wife, I can't find my car keys. And my wife very amusingly pointed to the table right in front of me where the car keys were and said, would those be the car keys that you can't find? And it was like, oh, yeah. And what happens when we get stressed is that part of our brain switches off. Our kidneys produce cortisol, which goes through the vagal system, which is like a highway through your spine. And it goes into the middle brain, and it floods the brain with cortisol. And what happens is that the top brain kind of switches off and we can't find things. And, and eventually, for those of you who've gone through the car key scenario, you'll remember that what happens is, of course, as the cortisol starts to dissipate, your brain fires up and there's the keys on the table. And it's the same with assignments. You think, I've got to get this assignment gone. You get stressed. And then, as Ken says, you look at the blinking cursor. So I've got a couple of tips that might be useful, Ken.
Well, please bring them on. Bring them on.
Well, let me ask you a question, Ken.
Okay.
How do you eat an elephant?
Over a very long period of time and probably in tiny, small portions.
There we go. Well, you're absolutely right. You eat an elephant a bite at a time. And I think that the best way is to kind of say, I'm going to do 20 minutes at a time. When I'm doing anything, writing or producing lectures, I do 20 minutes at a time and then have a few minutes off. I might make myself a cup of tea or look out the window or all the other things I enjoy doing. And then, then I go back to it. And also, I think it's about setting time. I think it's about sometimes being quite disciplined and saying, this is the time I'm going to be doing that. And, if people have busy lives, and sometimes the best way of reducing stress is to take yourself out of that busyness. And I know a lot of my students would come into college to write their assignments so they could stay away from the family and all the pressures. And can you do this? And can you do this? And, some even switch the phones off.
Yeah.
So they just had that time. And it's okay to have that time for you. So that's one tip. And the other is, lastminute.com. Don't wait until the last minute. Start as soon as you can, because some of the folios are big pieces of work, Ken. Yeah. And there'll be people out there writing dissertations as well.
Indeed. I like what you've said there and about setting a specific time. And what can sometimes happen, and I recognize this within my own life, is that when I've got a big pile of stuff hanging over me that I know that I have to do, it can sometimes move in and steal away my present moment peace. I can be driving my car and worrying about the work that I need to do. And the reality is, when you're driving your car, you can't do the work. So worrying about the work is only going to cause unrest within you emotionally. You can only worry about the work when you sat down with that cursor in front of you. Then you can do the work, or with pen or pencil in hand on your textbooks laid out. So by choosing a time period that you have allocated specifically to do your work, and then exercising abstinence of letting yourself get pulled into the emotional tumble of, I've got all this coming up, accepting for that time. When it comes up for you and you feel that overwhelming rush of panic, I'm speaking about my own experience, Rory, when I was doing my folio, to be able to say, it's okay, I have time set aside for that. I'm going to just push that out of my awareness now because it needs to be in that time. And that sometimes helps by saying, I've got a time set aside for that. Another way is to, this is a tip I got from you, Rory, is to make lists of your theory. So often you're going to be linking stuff to theory. It's part of what we do, and it's part of how the awarding bodies measure that we are hitting the criteria. They want to see those key trigger words, the theory trigger words. And if you've got lists of person-centered theory consists of, and you list out all the different theories, transactional analysis consists of, then when you're working on a certain assignment, you can have that list in front of you and kind of cross off the various bits of theory as you're weaving them into your assignment. So you've got kind of a checklist. I know that worked greatly for myself, Rory. Yeah,
checklists are really good. You can tick them off. And also stick with the knitting. I think that sometimes overthinking can be a bit of a problem for students, and someone who's marked pieces of work, lovely pieces of work, brilliant pieces of work. I've enjoyed reading them. Unfortunately, they don't link to what the question's being asked. And I used to say to my students, what colour's that wall? And they used to say, it's white. So, well, that's the question. So if someone says, what colour's that wall? You write, it's white. What you don't do is you say it's white and it's got textured wallpaper on and it's part of the wall and it's 7 foot long or 3 metres long or whatever. You say it's white. It's about looking at the assignment question and being very precise and very accurate about what's being asked. And sometimes it's good just to break it down and just highlight with a highlighter pen what's being asked. Analyze the theory, so analyzing the theory, that's all you're doing. Or analyze his supervision theory, that's all you're doing. So it's about being very disciplined and not kind of overthinking it. The people who are marking it are not looking for a magnum opus of genius. What they're looking for is you hit the criteria, and I think sometimes that's a bit missed by students.
I like what you used there of the analogy of the wall, and also marking assignments handed in by learners. It's very easy when the question is, please describe the color of that wall, to say, I am staring at the wall. Walls are rather large. There are many different kinds of walls that we may get. Some walls are long, some are high, some are made of brick, some are made of breeze block. And you can really write a lot about walls because you studied walls. Or insert the topic of the counselling related topic here, but you're not answering the question, what is the colour of the wall? Having the question on hand and referring back as you're doing your assignments or putting in your project work, yeah, I like that one. And it can definitely reduce that stress level. You keep on looking back at the question and say, am I answering this question? If you are, a sudden calm may descend over you. If you're a member of the Counselling Study resource that Rory and I put together, log in and go to the assignment section. So if you click on assignments, right at the top, Rory wrote a book about making your way through assignments, what the marker is looking for and how to make it easy, how not to jolt them out of their flow as they're marking, because as soon as they've been jolted out of their flow and they go, oh, hold on, an area of concern, they look differently, they read your assignment differently. So if you are a member of our Counselling Study resource, go and have a look at that. Also, if you're in the Counselling Study resource, a great resource is if you go to the support section, click on the support tab, it's right at the top, there is a video that's called How to Use Counselling Study Resource for Your Assignments. Go and watch it. It's about a 5-minute video and it'll show you how to use the CSR to help you with your assignments, and that again can also reduce that pressure. So if you're not a member of Counselling Study Resource, go and have a look at it. You can find that by going to counsellingtutor.com. It's on my other website. It's right slap bang middle of the page at the top on the home page, and you can download the prospectus and see what that's about.
Absolutely. I remember there's 2 L's in counselling. We spell it the English, UK, British way. So, theory with Rory, Ken. It's a bit of a special theory this time, isn't it?
Trauma bonds. I'm excited to learn more.
Yes, well, it's a little. I touched a little bit on trauma bonds in a recent series of lectures that I've done for the Counselling Study resource, which has been really well received. It's called, preparing to work with clients who've experienced abuse and trauma, and trauma bonds are effectively post-traumatic stress markers that bind someone who's been abused or victimized to their abuser. And it does link in very much to Stockholm Syndrome, another lecture that I've done earlier in the year. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about trauma bonds and what they look like in reality, how trauma bonds work. And it might be that as I explain it, you realize that you may have mild trauma bonds yourself, that meeting certain people may trigger off certain behaviors in you. And that's about our old friend transference. Again, we always talk about transference. And I'm going to be giving a handout just overviewing trauma bonds. So make sure that you go to the mother page at counsellingtutor.com, look for this particular episode, and you can download that handout. It's going to be informative, Cam.
It is indeed. So without any further ado, let's dive in, because the water is lovely, to Theory with Rory.
Counselling Theory with Rory Lees-Oakes.
So in this part of the theory section, I'm going to be talking about trauma bonds. So a little bit of a kind of health warning if you feel you may be triggered, or anybody listening to this may be triggered regarding discussions of abuse, then maybe this section you want to go through and go on to the end section. So it's just a little bit of a health warning, really. But trauma bonds are something that we see quite a lot as therapists, and it's something that can be quite an ongoing theme if you work for a long time as a counsellor. And as I said in the introduction, there was a film called The Night Porter with Bogart and Charlotte Rampling. And the basis of the film was that an SS guard and a concentration camp inmate form a relationship, a non-consensual relationship in the concentration camp. And then many years later, they meet again. And that relationship is rekindled along with the abusive practices. And at the time, people said, this is just fantasy, it couldn't happen. Why would someone go back? Why would they do that? And as the years have gone on, psychologists and therapists have begun to realise that trauma bonding or trauma bonds is a very real phenomenon that happens when someone is in a very violent relationship. And there are some specific elements within that relationship which makes a person more likely to be trauma bonded. And the first is violence or the threats of violence. Almost certainly one of the hallmarks of an abusive relationship is someone being violent or threatening to be violent. Add to that the notion that the abuser then rotates kindness and abuse. So it becomes quite confusing. And what can happen in the mind of the victim is that they believe that violence is linked to kindness. So when the abuser's being kind to them, it's kind of, well, that's all right. Violence and kindness are the same thing. And it can get so confused in someone's mind that they actually believe that. There's also a notion that victims carry around with them, trauma-bonded victims, that any form of retaliation is going to get more violence, so they become more passive and more accepting of the situation. They give up part of their free will. They exchange it for what they consider safety, although the reality is that they're never safe. Some abusers use isolation as a form of bonding, cutting people off from family, friends, relatives, that type of thing. And I guess maybe in a subconscious level, or maybe it's a very conscious level, victims of trauma bonding or people who are trauma bonded may carry shame. They may carry shame about being raped. It might be that some trauma bonded clients get involved in sex work, and it could also be around losing their virginity. The fact that it wasn't lost in a consensual way, it was taken from them. So what are the major indications of trauma bonding? Well, there is some indications that we can pick up from clients. I think the first thing is in the narrative, how clients talk about their relationship, and that can give us real clues into where they are in terms of how connected they are with the abuser. So the first thing is the client shows symptoms of post-traumatic stress, and that can be things like flashbacks. It can be all of a sudden flashing back in the therapy room and talking like a child. It can be literally losing control. So you might get someone who's crying. All those are aspects of post-traumatic stress. The other aspect of it is that there is a belief that something bad is going to happen at any minute. One of the hallmarks of PTSD, when someone is kind of really struggling with it, is that at any moment the abuser can return. And, I know of one instance that someone I know, it wasn't a client, but someone I knew, actually believed that their abuser was in the local pub. When the fact of the matter is, the abuser was serving a huge sentence in a prison many miles away. But it was just literally seeing a person triggered off this idea, really believed that the person was omnipotent. And at one point, this person I was talking about actually believed that he could get out of prison, that he had control over the whole prison system and he could get out, and he really was in the pub. And it took some convincing to say, no, there's no chance, there's absolutely no chance at all this person is going to escape. He went to prison for a very serious sentence, and he's not going to be let out. He's residing, as we speak, in a cell. The person you're talking about isn't him. And that was the facts of the matter. One of the other hallmarks of someone who's trauma bonded is being intensely grateful for small things. In my experience, I've heard people talk about being super excited about being let out to go to the shops. You know, he lets me out to do the shopping, is a kind of narrative that clients might bring. The other interesting thing, and I use the word interestingly thoughtful, is that victims of trauma bonding deny violence. So, you know, I might say to someone, a client, but he hits you. You've said he hits you. And the response to that might be, well, actually, he doesn't hit me hard. He could hit me a lot harder. And he doesn't hit me every day. He only hits me once a week or when I've been bad. And it's that kind of acceptance, passive acceptance of violence and minimising it, which again gives you a clue to someone who's trauma bonded. The other thing is that clients sometimes rationalise the violence. They will say, oh, well, he hit me because I deserved it because I had the TV on too loud, or I might have made him the wrong food, or I didn't wear the right dress. So of course he was entitled to hit me. And also, one of the very, very strong indicators is denying being angry at the perpetrator. You know, you might say, how hard do you feel about this person hitting you and doing this? Oh, I'm not angry at him. It's okay. This idea that there's absolutely no access to anger or an emotion which is negative towards the abuser. Another indication is that at some level they have control over the abuser. And I think this is something that comes up again and again and again. They think that they can control the abuser and control the situation, because as they do that, they believe it lessens the abuse. And one of the presenting issues that's absolutely striking is that they believe that it's their fault. And they will tell you, it's my fault. If I'd have just done that, if I'd just cooked that meal nicer, if I'd have just done this, they will always put the blame on themselves because the abusers conditioned them to believe that. So just to recap, and I'm going to have to do this in a handout, it might be that the client is really vigilant about the abuser's needs. Will do anything to keep the abuser happy. Maybe tries to understand the motivations of the abuser. So that might be, say, well, he had a bad childhood, and that's why he's angry, as if that makes it okay. And they may not have a perspective. They may say, well, I don't know why he does it. You know, they also have a sense of self as experienced through the abuser's eyes. So it's very possible that person might say, well, he will hit me because I'm ugly, fat, short, name any kind of illogical thing for being hit. And it might be that the victim has interjected that and believed it. And they also might say that the people on the outside trying to help them are bad guys. This can sometimes happen in refuges for abused women, where they believe that the people who are trying to help them are in fact the bad guys and that they can't help them and they'd rather go back. And they see the abuser actually as a protector. Well, he's big and strong, he can protect me. So those are the bases of trauma bonding. And it's interesting how we work with that. And how we work with it is to give the client space, hear their story, and to gently challenge their perceptions. In my experience, that can take a little time. So what I've done is I've made a handout just to give you the major indications of trauma bonding, just so that you can see it if it comes up in your practice.
Thank you, Rory. Always interesting. And of course, if you want to get Rory's super duper handout, if you've had any of Rory's handouts, you're going to know how valuable they are. It's great to have on file and refer back to. You can get that right now. Just go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, go to episode number 46, and you can download that directly from the show notes page. So coming away from trauma bonds, Rory, and looking at personal therapy, called upon to maybe go into therapy ourselves as student counsellors, as trainees, and examine our own stuff. But sometimes a student may look at this and go, well, I don't really know that I need any therapy. I've worked through a lot of my stuff in groups, doing simulated sessions, maybe in PD group. Why would I need to go to therapy? Is it maybe that I can go and see how another counsellor does it? What's it about, Rory?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting. There is a principled argument that people can't be sent for therapy, and certainly in counselling courses, technically they are, because when people sign up, they're asked to undertake a certain amount of personal therapy. And I'll talk about that first. I was speaking with my good friend Bob Cook from the Manchester Institute of Psychotherapy last night. We're having a Skype conversation. And I know that in his training, he trains TA therapists. They have 60 hours of their own therapy. 60 hours.
Wow.
And in some psychodynamic trainings, you're in therapy twice a week for 3 years.
Yeah.
And if you're doing Jungian psychotherapy, Jungian psychology, from what I can gather, I don't know too much about it, you're in therapy permanently, I think. Yeah. So there is a difference between which course you do. Usually on counselling courses, it's between 10 and 20 hours. And there's a really good reason for it, and I'll share the reason. One of the things is that through the arc of the course, a lot of people begin to change and they begin to see the world slightly differently. And also they begin to realise things that have happened. And, you know, I can think of a number of occasions through the year where where a student said something to me and I've said something back and they've gone, oh, I never thought of it like that. And you can see that the foundations of their reality is shook. And sometimes on personal therapy is really, really useful to explore that. It's also a safety valve because I know at least of one person that I trained with who ended up sectioned a few years ago. The person didn't have his own personal therapy. And what came out, and I'm not going to talk about what came out, was the fact that it would have really helped. It would have helped that person.
Yeah.
And I have to say that I always smile slightly when students used to say to me, I don't need my own personal therapy. And after about 3 weeks of it, they've said, I'm so glad I've gone to my own personal therapy. Yeah. Because as you say, Ken, it can be about seeing how another practitioner operates, experiencing therapy as yourself and exploring. And it's a great opportunity, I think, to explore your own world where someone, how often do we get non-judgmental listening? Yeah. How often?
I agree.
Yeah. And it gives a sense of what the client's experience is. So I think it's a good thing. But yeah, I do acknowledge that in courses students are technically sent for it, but I think it's a good reason. I've never heard any practitioner ever who's ever said it's a bad idea.
And that's interesting. And that's any practitioner who has gone through that process, I guess, because it means examining yourself. It means putting yourself into a situation where you're being open to looking around. And there's an interesting exercise that is sometimes done during training, and it's usually done around personal development, and it's called Johari's window. And Johari's window kind of is an exercise that shows us that there are things that are unseen to us. They may even be seen by others. Somebody might look at it and think, wow, you tend to show this kind of behavior, but we ourselves maybe don't see that. So if we only go on what is seen to us, and we're going into being a practitioner and being there for other people, and we're not fully together, things can come up in therapy that can really throw us off, that can create feelings within us that we might run off to our supervisors with. And these are things that you might be able to work through in therapy because they may be seen by others, and your therapist may pick those up. So, yeah, I agree with you, Rory. I think anyone who's saying, I'm 100% together, I don't need therapy, maybe it's about examining what that is about. Very often therapy, I see therapy is perceived as a place that you go when you're really in distress, and very often it is that a client may come in carrying a very heavy load, having tried everything, and it is their last resort. But therapy can also be a place of great personal development. You don't have to be miserable and depressed to go into therapy. It's about examining yourself honestly with a fellow human being with those core conditions in place. So yes, and I also acknowledge that you get to be a service user in the service that you are training to provide, and to see what that's like. And you may even take something away from your therapy, your own personal therapy. I know I certainly did, where you go, well, I certainly won't be doing that with my clients because something may jar for you. So it's a learning experience either way. And we go to that therapy, and the reason it is called for us to go into it is in service of our clients.
Absolutely. And in, just building on that idea, in service of the client, Ken, if you're working with clients who've experienced trauma or abuse, you've got to be very sure, and I mentioned this in my recent lecture on trauma and abuse, that you are okay, that you are strong enough to withstand the material, the waves rushing at you of the emotion, that you're strong enough to be able to be anchored in the ground, being the adult in the therapy room, to be able to contain and support and hold a client emotionally. And, sometimes stuff comes up and it needs to be worked through in therapy so that we don't get caught up in our own processes. So I still believe it's a good idea. And it is interesting, just the varying amounts of therapy you have. TA therapists have 60 hours, 20 hours on some person-centered courses, 10 hours. It is quite varied, but definitely a good idea, Ken.
Indeed. And speaking of varied, it's been a varied episode, I guess, starting off episode 46, looking at the stress that may be linked to this time of year and maybe assignments that may be outstanding that you need to work on, looking at trauma bonds with with Rory, and of course, just ending off right now with that debate on own personal therapy. We'd love to hear your input, your thoughts on this. Best way to do that, bob on over to Facebook, pop in the words Counselling Tutor. That's going to bring you to our Facebook group. Close on 8,000 like-minded individuals from all around the world, students of counselling and psychotherapy, are there waiting already in discussion. Come and join us. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love you to be part of our group.
Yeah, well, that ends this episode 46. Episode 46 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. So we're so glad and so pleased that you joined us. And if you want to leave us a little review on iTunes, we'd be so grateful of that. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.